Hi, so this is a short PowerPoint lecture over mental health and mental illness. So I will go ahead and share the PowerPoint. So what we want to think about is that mental health and mental illness are on a continuum. Very few people are either completely mentally ill or completely mentally healthy. So what we try to do is keep our mental health in the well-being area. So, you have some mild stress and distress, but no major impairments. What we start to see when people get to the other end of the continuum is that they have emotional problems, and then they have actual mental illness. So you want to think about the left side being, a 10 on a continuum and 0 being all the way on the right side. And that will kind of help you as you answer your journal. So there's different signs of mental illness. So there's really, 7 different areas that we often think of. And you want to think about how each area kind of affects the other areas. So we have happiness, controlled behavior, appraisal of reality, effective in work, healthy self-concept, satisfying relationships, effective coping. So think about, if you don't have a healthy self-concept, is that going to affect your happiness? Is that going to affect your relationships? So it may be very difficult to have those satisfying relationships if you don't have a good concept of yourself or control over your behaviors. So some attributes of mental health, things that we think of: accurate appraisal of reality. So again, this goes right along with the last slide. Ability to love and experience joy, capacity to deal with conflicting emotions. So can we sometimes be both happy and disappointed in something, or content and content as well as slightly stressed with a situation? So we might be happy that something happens, but we might be stressed about it happening. Can we live without undue fear, guilt, or anxiety? Can you take responsibilities for your own actions? So that's a big one that many people with mental illness have difficulties with. Controlling behaviors, able to laugh and to play, maintain healthy self-concept and self-value, work and be productive, negotiate developmental tasks, attain self-defined spirituality. So we want to be able to make sure that we can relate to others, so have relationships, close adaptive relationships, empathy, so being able to put yourself in somebody else's shoes, manage interpersonal conflict constructively. Do we always agree with everybody else? No, but do we know how to manage that conflict without fighting, arguing, shutting down? We want to make sure that we think clearly, so problems are able to problem solve and use good judgment, think logically, reach insightful conclusions, be creative when you're thinking about situations. So it's not that we have to have all of these attributes all the time, but if we have most of these attributes, that would make us, tend to think that we're more towards the mental health continuum versus the side that is more mental illness. So factors that affect mental health. So mental health is much more than just that we are thinking and feeling at a given time. There's lots of different factors that can influence our ability to attain mental health. And so there's lots of mental illnesses: schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, depression, PTSD, that have genetic components. So there is that genetic or biological influences that we have. as well as the hormonal influences, um, that and even brain structure influences on mental illness. And not only that, our mental health is very much affected by environmental factors. So, and stress, as you probably already know, stress affects how our mental health is. So, we all go through stress, but just because you go through stress doesn't mean that you're going to end up with a mental illness. So, a lot of it has to do with maybe your health practices and beliefs, your personality traits, how many stressors that you're experiencing at one time, and if there's also maybe developmental events that are going on, your support that's available. Do you have an excellent support system to help you through these stressful times? So there is an idea that some of us, because of our genetics, are more prone to stressors triggering mental illness. And some people are more genetically resilient than others. So um, we'll discuss that more a little bit later, though. Mental illness is difficult to clearly define. It has generally been partially defined as behaviors that are considered abnormal in a society. That means that mental illness may vary slightly from one culture to another. Mental illness is difficult to define because behavioral expectations change over time, and the person diagnosing the mental illness may have a different culture from the person potentially experiencing the diagnosis or the mental illness. Also, there's a lot of myths and misconceptions. May think that all people with mental illness are, violent, and that's absolutely not the case. Um, there's not a clear, consistent line between mental illness and mental health. So people kind of fluctuate back and forth along that continuum. So psychiatry's definition of mental health has changed, and it reflects cultural norms, societal expectations, values, and professional biases, unfortunately, and individual differences, and even sometimes political climate. So why is it so unclear? Well, everybody has a different background and culture. We grow intellectually and emotionally at different rates. So what might be normal at one time for one person may not be normal for another person. We make different decisions at different times depending on what's going on in our lives. And we choose to or choose not to evaluate behaviors. People grow within themselves, and they have or have no spiritual beliefs. So they may have spiritual beliefs or not. So because of all of these differences, one definition of mental health, it is very difficult to attain. Think about how you might react if you found out that a person you love was just in a serious car accident. If someone looked at you not knowing the circumstances, might you appear as though you had a mental illness? If one person goes into a trance to connect to a higher power and another person doesn't believe in a higher power, might that make it seem as if one of those people is acting strangely? So just some things to consider. Stigma. Stigma is definitely something we're going to be talking about in this course. It's a huge barrier to someone getting mental health help, or for families to get their loved ones mental health treatment. So stigma has been acknowledged to be a major barrier to mental health treatment and recovery for years, decades now. Stigmatizing attitudes towards individuals who are mentally ill have harmful effects on the family and the individual. So it's a collection of negative attitudes, beliefs, thoughts, and behaviors that influence the individual and general public. Psychosocial processes that lead to stigmatization include stereotyping, labeling, separating, and status loss or discrimination in the context of power imbalance, social isolation, and reduced opportunities. So what does that mean? Basically, it means that you might think that somebody who has schizophrenia is violent. And so they're stigmatized as violent. People don't want to be around them. They don't want them living near them. And so they may get discriminated against as far as their, as their housing, the way they're just treated on a day-to-day basis, unfortunately. So they can end up, isolated, not having the same opportunities that everybody else has. So in order to be diagnosed with mental illness, we use a DSM. So psychiatrists use something called the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistic Manual. And these are medical diagnoses. So this is also actually nicknamed the Bible for psychiatry. And it does have a huge impact on how mental illness is viewed. And it changes over time. So previous versions of the DSM, used to have homosexuality as a mental illness. And so this is an example of how society changes over time, and therefore these medical diagnoses of mental illness change over time too. So each of the mental disorders is conceptualized as a clinically significant behavioral syndrome or pattern that occurs in an individual and is associated with present distress or disability, or a significant increased risk of suffering, death, pain, disability, or important loss of freedom. So that's how the DSM classifies mental health diagnoses. As I said, it's considered the Bible. In psychiatry, it is important to stress that the DSM diagnosis classifies a disorder that a person has and not the person. So when we talk about labeling people, someone is schizophrenic. They're a person that happens to have schizophrenia. And I think that if we can keep that in mind, that it can help reduce stigmatization a lot. The text of the DSM avoids the use of expressions such as a schizophrenic or an alcoholic, and uses an individual with schizophrenia or an individual with alcohol dependence. And I think that is really important to understand. The DSM is also helpful in categorizing different observable behaviors and subjective symptoms into mental illness diagnoses. The DSM is used to diagnose psychiatric disorders, as I mentioned, and it includes information specifically related to culture in 3 areas. It discusses cultural variation for each clinical disorder, describes culture-bound syndromes. So there are some illnesses that are really only found in specific cultures. And it outlines to assist clinicians in evaluating and reporting the impact of an individual's cultural context. And this is to help our clinicians not make biased diagnoses. Community mental health. So clients are often managed in a community. There may be different services available to people with mental health, with mental illness in your area. You'll have to find and describe it for one of your discussion questions this session. The different community resources can be anything from support groups, community mental health services, county or state supports, volunteer religious organization, group homes, homeless shelters, etc. So there's lots of different ways that the community supports mental health. They have crisis response, family community support, peer support, income support, housing, health and dental care, mental health treatment, identifying the client initially, protection, advocacy, and rehabilitation services. Many mental illness clients will have case managers that will help them organize their care and link them with the services to help them fund the care that they do require. Having a sound community resource structure can make a huge difference in whether or not a person with mental illness is able to remain out of the hospital for long periods of time. Not having a structure of support in the community can make managing mental illness extremely difficult. Luckily in this area, we do tend to have a fairly strong or robust community mental health services available to clients, but it is not the case everywhere. So as I mentioned, this is just a short introductory lecture to get you thinking about mental health and mental illness, maybe in a way that you hadn't before. Thanks.